Hello, good morning, good afternoon, good evening, depending on which part of the world that you're joining us from. Greetings from a rainy South Africa. My name is Rachel Sabande, and I am Senior Director in charge of Country Outreach at the Digital Impact Alliance. Today, we're here to talk about a very important and exciting subject. We're calling this conversation In Machines We Trust. It's a question. And so I'm joined by two distinguished panelists that I will be introducing you to shortly. And so to begin with, I wanted to start off by talking about the advances that we've seen in technology in recent years. There have been exponential changes in technology, which have led to advancements in fields such as artificial intelligence. And with that has come the use of algorithmic decision-making becoming more prevalent in the public sector worldwide, but also within governments in developing countries. We have seen that governments in developing countries are beginning to deploy algorithms to deliver citizen and business services as part of their digital transformation agenda. But while we're at it, we've also heard from champions and cheerleaders on the use of artificial intelligence or algorithms talk about the benefits that artificial intelligence and algorithms bring, some of which are increased productivity, innovativeness, and economic development. We've also heard from watchdogs that have spoken about the loss of privacy as an issue of concern, issues of agency, discrimination, and drastic loss of jobs as some of the issues to look out for in terms of the use of artificial intelligence and algorithms by governments for decision-making. And this is the reason today we gather here to examine some of those competing perspectives. And so we will be examining the question whether use of artificial intelligence or algorithms in government creates a more inclusive, equitable, or trusted digital future for the people. And to help us make sense of this question, to help us to get started on this conversation, are two colleagues who are respected, accomplished in their various spaces within the digital transformation ecosystem. First, I introduce to you to Saryu. She is the founder of APTI Institute. She works on questions at the intersection of technology and society. APTI Institute works on inclusion, access, governance of technologies, and data governance through its two labs, the Digital Public Lab and the Data Economy Lab. Saryu has a PhD in political science from King's College London, a MPA from the School of International and Public Affairs at Columbia University, and a Bachelor of Arts LLB from the National Law School of India University in Bangalore. Saryu, you're welcome to this conversation today.
Hi, Rachel. It's a pleasure to be here.
Pleasure is mine. And joining us next is Pia Andrews. Pia is a serial government transformer. She is an open government digital transformation and data geek. Priya usually works within the public sector machine to transform public services, policies, and culture through greater transparency, democratic engagement, citizen-centric design, open data, emerging technologies, and programmatic innovation in the public sector and beyond. Pia was recognized in 2018 and 2019 as one of the global top government and was awarded as one of the top 100 most influential women in Australia for 2014. Now, interestingly, Pia has also studied martial arts since 1990, and she brings the philosophies and practices of Kung Fu and Chan Buddhism into her work every day. Pia, you're welcome to the conversation today.
Thank you so much. It's a pleasure to be here with both of you.
Thank you. So I wanted to dive in right straight into the conversation without much ado. And I wanted to start with you, Pia, to present to us the utopian future of whether algorithms are there to drive an equitable, trusted, or digital future or otherwise. Pia, over.
Thank you so much. I might just start by quickly acknowledging that I'm coming to you from the land of the Algonquin people here in Canada, usually based on Yaru lands in Australia, and just want to pay my respects to their leaders and knowledge systems, past and present and emerging. I think it's fairly clear we're not in a utopia today, but I believe very strongly that unless we design amazing and optimistic futures to work towards, then we continue to just perpetuate current systems. So I'm going to be a little cheeky for my 5 minutes and talk to you all about coming to you live from 2042, in another 20 years in the future. I'd like to welcome you to our utopian use of augmented intelligence, because of course we've already had the dark ages of 2022, where artificial intelligence was all the rage. We've made a few bits of progress since then, and I want to talk to you about how great it is. So first of all, augmented intelligence is really about using these tools, machine learning and automation, to be able to help people do their job better, to help people navigate complexity better. We've got, for instance, every time government comes out with a new policy proposal or regulatory proposal, my personal AI knows that it's happened, notifies me, asks me if I'd like to put in my usual preferences, helps model the impact of that change on my life, my community, my business, my country, and it helps me actually engage with those policy conversations in a more participatory way from a position of understanding impact. The second thing is that back in the 2020s, there was no consistent measuring of the human impact of government systems or policies. Everyone was so obsessed with user experience and customer experience and focusing on performance of technology that unfortunately our use of artificial intelligence at the time kept creating systems that that gave us economic return, but at the cost of human life, human impact, and human quality of living. So by 2042, we've put in place all of the human impact and policy impact measurement systems, so that now even a nefarious bot is systemically motivated to actually create good quality of life outcomes for people. We've got a situation where regulation is real time, where people have control over their personal data and are able to give just-in-time consent for decision making. But probably most importantly, we recognized that the 2020s kept using machine learning to do decision-making systems in government. And of course, that's contradictory with rule of law, because common inputs getting different outputs over time, that's not the result of a judgment by the judiciary, is a real problem. The inability to have explainable or auditable or appealable decisions from government systems that used machine learning was a real problem. So here we are in 2042, and we've realized that we can use machine learning based AI for all kinds of great uses, for analysis, for content, for lots of things. But when it came to actual automated decision-making systems, we decided to start using rules-based systems rather than machine learning-based systems, so that we could avoid the inevitable bias that every data set creates over time when you try to take a machine learning approach to access to justice. So we're living in this fabulous future. Artificial intelligence shifted to augmented intelligence. We put in place human measurement, legislation and regulation as code, so that we can test and assure outcomes, and we've got a more explainable, more consistent application of justice, and we're not just relying on humans in the loop to make things better, because historically that hasn't always worked out so well for us. So I look forward to getting to this utopia with you all and exploring what the pros and cons are to get there. Thank you.
Thanks, Pia. That's interesting. Can't wait to get to 2042 and see artificial intelligence transition to augmented intelligence. Passing on to you, Saryu. What's the dystopian view?
Well, the dystopian view is quite dark, but I must say that before I sort of jump into what that dystopia might look like, that I am here from a very rainy and somewhat cold Bangalore, which considers itself the technology capital of the country and sort of imagines itself as a digitized future. So maybe in 2042 already, but things do look dark here. There are several things that technology can achieve and has achieved in the future that we're living in. First of all, technology and algorithms more broadly have delivered individual value in the way that Pia mentioned, but in doing so, it has atomized us into individual units and broken down every and all notions of community. So it's created islands and bubbles, one person small. What technology and algorithms have done is also reduced friction quite significantly, and in doing so, introduced determinism. So we are all products of our past, the data that defines us. Um, just to explain here what technology has been able to do in the time that we live in is encode decisions, encode processes, encode ideas into technology, such as if A happens, then B is the most natural outcome. So there's no more room at the margins to be anything but what technology allows you to do. So we are determined by what the process or the algorithm allows or permits. What technology has done over the last few years is also learned, and in doing so, learned from itself to build a fairly unequal society. It has learned from the data that's been fed into it, so it's picked up very many bad things about from our society. It has imbibed values such as misogyny, racism, and quite a few significant problems. What it has also not been able to do, because it has no agency of its own, is not learn from what's not before it, which means the data of those individuals and communities that are not necessarily digitized has not been incorporated into what technology has been able to do or been able to learn. Consequently, we live in a system or a society where inequality and biases are quite rampant, and they're both perpetuated. The old ones are perpetuated, and new ones are created through the growth of technology. What technology has also been able to offer for us is that it can record everything. And in doing so, it has enabled huge violations of privacy and has enabled a context of surveillance by the state. Because it can record every transaction, every aspect of what we do, anything that can be atomized and digitized. What it means is that if it exists, somebody can look at it, and it is the state that does its best to look into this and make sense of our lives. Technology also very faithfully reflects the values of those who build it. So that's a wonderful thing about it. But in being so, it has become a weapon of the state. It has amplified intent most significantly. Over the last few years, we've also seen a decline of democracy. So the notion of a liberal democracy with various institutions standing in check against each other has been eroded in many parts of the world. And so this political reality is also reflected in the technology that states use to manage, control, and surveil their citizens. Corporations are critical to the development of the technology that we use in today's world, and in maximizing shareholder value, they have completely capitulated to the values that states wish for them to imbibe in their technology. And here we are in a dystopian 2042, where technology governs, rules us all. And this is not too far from where we are today in reality. And it would be wonderful to continue this discussion and try and understand what might prevent us from getting to this vision of 2042. Back to you, Rachel.
Thanks very much, Saryu. Quite interesting perspectives from you both there. But that does look like a very dark world, Saryu. I mean, you spoke about, tech enhancing determinism and breaking us down into islands and communities. You threw some elements of how it's likely to perpetuate racism, misogamy, surveillance, and it becoming a weapon of the state. I hope that, there can be a way in which we can, find ourselves in the middle for a better world between those two pictures that you've both have painted. But just to delve in a little deeper into the conversation, I wanted to hear from you both your own assessment on some perspectives around the area of artificial intelligence and algorithms. And I wanted to start off with a question around data, because data is fundamental to these perspectives. So in your own experience, if you can be able to share with us some examples of what you have seen from your work and your spaces around whether you think there is sufficient data, and that is it reliable and representative to represent like local populations in some of these systems. Maybe I'll start with you, Pia.
Sure. So first of all, I think it's very important to recognize that the dystopia that Saryu pointed out is exactly where we're heading unless we make strategic decisions to do something other than what is currently happening. So I think people get very, very focused on data because data is the blood of machine learning-based AI. But it's not the only type of AI out there. And if we start and end with it's all about the data, it's all about, trying to create equitable data, it's all about trying to create, inclusive data to train the AI, then we are presuming that the only use of AI is machine learning based. Machine learning based decision-making systems are not suitable for government use. And the reason for that is because if you can't explain the legal authority, the legislative or regulatory authority upon which that decision was made, then you are now not compliant with administrative law. That's the first problem. The second problem is if you are using machine learning-based systems, then over time, the training of the system over time will change the output. So the same input will get a different output at different points in time, which means you're now contradicting rule of law. If you are not getting the same output from the same input, and that change in interpretation is not accountable to someone, whether it's a public servant or a judiciary, then again, massive issue with inequitable application of the law. Whether it's more fair or less fair, the output is kind of irrelevant. There's no accountability to that difference in translation over time. So my first point is you can't just focus on data. You should, look at what's the use cases you want to use AI for. If you want to use it for decision making, then it can't just be data. It has to be legislation and regulation as code. It has to be your legal authorities available in a code format. And you should be using rules-based AI, not machine learning-based AI explicitly for that purpose. But if you want to use AI for research, for analysis, for running over your data to see where the patterns are, for personal AI, there's so many other use cases where machine learning-based approaches are suitable and appropriate and still need to be governed by good data and all the rest. But it's a very different situation for decision making that actually affects a person. So I guess data plus rules, and then the final point there is incentive systems. If you continue to measure success by pure efficiency agendas or pure economic indicators, it is inevitable that even well-drafted rules, even well-intentioned AIs, even well-written algorithms will eventually prioritize money over people, which is fine for a private sector, it's fine for lots of sectors, but it's not fine for the government sector. So we need to build that third recipe, third ingredient for the recipe, which is actual human impact measurement systems to make sure that our whether it's a machine learning-based system, whether it's any form of AI, or indeed any form of policy or service that we deliver, should be measurably driving good public outcomes that improve quality of life in a measurable way. And I'll leave it there. Thank you.
Very interesting. I think that is really enlightening, Pia, because you bring in an important aspect to say it is better to use rules-based AI if it is for government use, because machine learning is not suitable for decision-making, which requires some legal mandate. And that means that there's potential that it could contradict with the law. What are your thoughts, Saryu?
Yes, absolutely. I agree with much of what Pia said, but I think the one point of difference is that while I agree that rules-based AI should be the predominant form of AI used by the state, there are potentially marginal use cases for machine learning algorithms to play a role in enabling state function. And one example could be in the context of, let's say, the judiciary. And if you think of that as a singularly important state function, there is a role that machine learning type AI can play a role. I think there's also other types of state function, particularly, the preservation of public health, for example, where AI can have a very useful role in predicting, let's say, the occurrence of a pandemic. So there are sort of different use cases related to state function, but not necessarily in enabling it or supporting it in a very direct way, where different types of AI can play multiple roles. So with that said, I think going back to the point around data being the feeder for the development of very many types of AI, it's important to pay attention to patterns of data marginalization that occur in society. In countries such as India, where we do a large amount of our work, there's enormous empirical evidence that shows that women, elderly, those outside very many of the big cities are not on the data map. So they're not on the digital map. And what this means is that any system that's based on this kind of input data is likely to be flawed and replicating very many of the challenges that already exist in society. So it reinforces or replicates or exacerbates inequalities that already exist. That's the first. The second is, and I sort of alluded to it in the earlier part of the conversation, is the idea that we're functioning within liberal democratic systems in entirety, where institutions are working, where there's a free and fair electoral process. So all of the assumptions that come with the idea of a liberal democracy. In many parts of the world, this is not true. It's just not true because the political system is different. And it's also possibly not true because there have been changes in the way political systems function. There's been a rise of nationalism in many parts of the world. So all of this means that technology and, in that sense, data operate within very loaded political context. And I think to abstract the data question out of the context in which it's usually deployed for the perpetuation of power very often, but devoid of the context in which it's deployed, I think that might be a little bit problematic. So just to say that data is not an abstract question, that to my mind arise after we've addressed some of the questions and challenges around the context in which we operate. And I'll pause here.
Thanks, Saryu. You bring an important point that we need to understand. Who are we leaving behind as we look at data? You particularly mentioned of women, children, maybe the elderly, the poor. But certainly, yes, there is a lot of good use cases around artificial intelligence and data. I'll get back to you on that point of who are we leaving behind, but I wanted to go back to Pia. Did you have any additional reflections?
Thank you. I just wanted to completely love and agree with everything Saryu says. So this is going to be, I think, more a co-creation kind of panel, then I think the concept of having people at opposite ends of a spectrum, if you take an evidence-based approach, it should be a mutually shared approach, which is a lovely a change from quite some panels I come on. So I just totally want to endorse and agree with that notion that when it comes to decision-making systems, what benefit are you eligible for? What's your tax status? What's your access to something? What's your visa status? These things are all very prescriptive decision-making systems that the rules-based approach makes sense for. But outside of decision-making systems that actually take an action that needs to be explainable and accountable to people, which I'll return to in a second, there's a wealth of opportunity for machine learning in government. I think that opportunities around health is absolutely substantial, being able to use machine learning to identify patterns, to early indications. In Australia, we have a amazing project of using latest high quality eye imaging on communities in cities and in very remote places, which it's been the use of machine learning AI that has helped be able to identify and tell a person in real time as they're being imaged that it looks like there's an early onset or risk of diabetes or these kinds of things. So there's so much opportunities for machine learning to assist in services, in support, in patterns recognition, in security analysis and risk assessment. My advocacy about rules-based AI and human impact measures is very much around decision-making systems and around policy development. And the final thing that's probably needed, if we're talking data plus rules plus human impact measurement systems, there is probably a fourth one, which is the right to an explanation. So New Zealand government, there is an explicit right to an explanation. If there is a decision made about you by government, then any citizen, any resident, any person in New Zealand explicitly has a right to say, I want an explanation, and the department needs to not just explain the decision, they need to provide all of the artifacts and arguably algorithms that sit behind how that decision was come to. So I think that those kinds of rights will become more normal around the world, and that will create, if you like, a business requirement for those decision-making systems to maintain explainability, not just be testable against the law, but be explainable according to the law.
Fantastic. I like how you put it, that we hope that this right to explanation can become embedded within most of these systems, but also the concept of rules-based AI. And I like how you frame the fact that perhaps measurement of these systems should focus more on human impact measurement to make them more valuable for people. So I wanted to move on and pick on something that both of you have alluded to, which is, who are we leaving behind? Who is being represented in this data or in machine learning or in artificial intelligence? How well informed are people about the role of algorithms in delivering services? And how much more could they get informed? And I'll start with you, Pia, because you just touched on the explainability aspect. My understanding is somebody will ask for an explanation, or they will know they have the right to an explanation if they are actually well informed. What's your take?
There is definitely a problem about just because someone has a right doesn't mean they know to use it. So you can, I think, go a step further. So in the Canadian government, it's not legislation, but they have a policy. The policy says that any service that takes a decision about a person is supposed to provide proactively an explanation of that decision as part of the service. I think that is another step, but I think having both of those things, the right to an explanation and a operational policy of providing an explanation proactively, would be very powerful, because just having a right doesn't mean people will know about it or use it. And that's what I think we've seen in New Zealand is everyone has that right, but very few people know they have that right and know that it is above and beyond, if you like, the usual accountabilities. In Australia, I'm sad to say that the concept, so the current federal government's ethical AI framework has treated the concept of transparency as that a user, a person, should have a right to know that they're interacting with an AI, which is okay. It doesn't give you transparency and accountability of how that AI works or what the algorithm is or the explainability. But it's an interesting concept that if you're interacting with an AI as opposed to a person, you should know. So I think that there's something interesting in that. And I think finally, the any government program that starts from the assumption that we just need to educate people and then it'll be fine, ignores the fact that 99% of the population don't have time to be educated about the niche thing that we want to educate them about. They're busy at work, they're busy at home, they're being pummeled by marketing on all sides, some of which is our marketing. There is no capacity. So if you want there to be a genuine, consistent application of a concept or a right, you either need to take that proactive explanation, which just becomes part of normal practice to provide the explanation as part of the service, because that's the point that people need it, and then they can save it and you can use it and all the rest of it. Or you need to identify other natural mechanisms that work for people, or you build it into the schooling system, and at least then you have a generational shift of people understanding their rights with regards to interacting with government. The key point there is, if there's not a natural insertion point for teaching or for people to engage with the concept or the information, then you have now created inequity, where the people that have the privilege, enough privilege to have space and time and capacity to want to or care to learn, will be benefited, and people who are vulnerable and disengaged or disaffected will always be at a disadvantage, which is obviously the opposite to what good public service.
Yeah, fantastic. Saryu, your thoughts on that?
No, absolutely. Like Pia, I resonate with Pia said. This definitely feels like we're in a space where we're co-creating some very interesting thoughts. Just on the question of explainability, and I think, the idea that people don't understand, there's a tendency to think about it in paternalistic terms, and I think we should be very careful of that. Everybody has a sense of injustice, but what caused that injustice and how it was brought about, that might be obscured and invisible. And I think thinking that through and sort of having that in the back of one's mind as one thinks about explainability in more detailed ways is very critical. So we should avoid being paternalistic about communities in general. I think the notion of a proactive explanation is useful, but I do think that the counterpoint to that, and again, something where more empirical evidence for sure is necessary, is that it could lead to a certain amount of fatigue if you're constantly bombarded with explanations. If they aren't themselves very accessible, there could be challenges around sort of continuing to engage, and nobody reads a privacy policy. Of course, it's hard to read, but it's not just about the way in which it's explained or the frequency in which which something is explained. I think the way in which it's explained, all of those sort of need to be accounted for. I think there's another sort of point in terms of thinking about explainability. While I agree that there's work to be done around how far the legal mandate goes in terms of explainability, I think there's also sort of intermediate measures, particularly that engage with civil society and the role that they play with the communities that they serve. So in what we've learned from our work with respect to public technologies is that access is often intermediated. So community leaders, civil society organizations, some of them very problematic partisan actors, all play a role in enabling individuals and communities to reach the state. So this citizen-state gap in reality is bridged by these different types of individuals. What they can additionally do is play a role with respect to explainability, and they already informally do. So, for example, with welfare, if somebody is rejected, they offer an explanation, which is very often sort of abstracted out of the context in which, or abstracted out of the technology itself and the process by which it made the decision. So I think thinking through the role that community intermediaries, civil society organizations, etc., can play is very critical. So I'll pause here and hope to come back to this should time permit.
Yeah, thanks, Sari. You bring an important point, reflecting on the role of the community, civil society organizations. And I also reflect on what you said earlier about, the patterns of data marginalization that we see and the fact that data exists in a political context. And when you look at political context globally, you're looking at, the disparity that's there between developed countries that set the agenda around these issues and the low and middle income countries. And so I wanted to know from you, because what we see is that most of these developing country contexts have very limited say in developing the standards for fairness, for transparency, and accountability of algorithmic decision making. We also see that most of the developing countries that are deploying algorithmic decision making are depending on big tech, and they have very little leverage on them. And I was just wondering to hear from you, what do you think are the levers for addressing these power imbalances that we see?
Right, I think this is a really complicated question, and here I'm wishing Pia went first, so I could build off of whatever amazing things she would say. But I think for sure across sort of, this is not just in the realm of technology, but I think, previously in IP, in sort of debates around intellectual property, in debates around trade, agendas are set not by low and middle income countries. So geopolitics plays a significant role in not just in the way standards are set around technology, but also in the way technology is imagined and designed and the role it could play in and of itself. So I don't know if it's a lever in any manner of speaking, but having country-specific contextualized discussions in forums such as these, but across, is, I think, a critical first step to sort of beginning to address the power imbalance. I think the second is also you made the point around the role big technology companies and big technology firms play, and in the strangest of ways, in some of the areas of policy work that we do, they have become more natural allies for civil society organizations than any other. And it is this that sort of brings about a problematic sort of power imbalance, because what it sort of enables is for big tech companies to push their agendas, which can, in perverse ways, empower the state even further. So just to give you an example, this is perhaps sort of a bit tangential to the context of our current discussion around AI, but India has a telecom bill which proposes that there would be de-encryption allowed on certain kinds of communication technologies. And what that means is that it can visit significant consequences on civil society and the right to dissent. But if you're allying with a corporation to protect communications for this, what that could also mean is over time, you're enabling the corporation to more actively resist impulses for justice delivery. So the short way to say all of this is that the notion of working with big technology companies is something that we all struggle with as civil society organizations. And I think, broadening the conversation to incorporate notions of shareholder values beyond I'm sorry, it's 10:30 p.m., so many apologies. But broadening the conversation to incorporate notions of stakeholder value over and above shareholder value, I think is also, I don't know if it's a lever as much as it's a necessary starting point to further the conversation around the role of technology and algorithms more broadly.
Thanks, Sariu, and thanks for being so gracious to make time for us at such a very unholy hour of the day, we'll definitely let you go sooner. Pia, just wanted to hear from you. What are your thoughts on how we can address some of these power imbalances that we see in the world of AI and machine learning as regards developing country contexts?
Thank you. I've unfortunately lost my soundproof booth, so if this sound is too loud, I've written my comments in green in our background document. So you tell me if it is too distracting, but otherwise I'll jump in. Here is the simple, somewhat inconvenient at times truth. Every country choice as to what tech they use it, the internal capability they build, who they procure from and how. Just because a company pushes a tool doesn't mean you have to use it. Just because someone says, here is the framework we suggest, doesn't mean you have to use it. I think the key here is, first of all, adopting and leveraging source frameworks. If we don't build transparency by design as a feature of these kinds of systems, then we will run the risk of creating untrustworthy systems that are locking us into what one company or one country or one perspective thing. Number two, you can build that into your internal capability or procurement requirements. Where required, make explainability a requirement. Have access to the algorithms. Publish, open source government models, open source government algorithms, as well as de-identify different implementations of data so other people can test the outcomes. So that kind of transparency approach can really help you not only maintain your sovereignty, but maintain control and public trust in the process, including supporting local companies to build sovereign solutions. But the final thing I would say is that you need to involve your populations in this process. Involve them in co-design of the policies, co-design, co-governance, invite the public and civil society groups and citizen advocates into the process of how you govern and oversee the use of AI in government systems, in the design of policy, in the design of services and the design of systems, to make sure that you maintain that independence. And if you design by default feedback loops so that citizens can feedback, so that staff and public servants can feedback, if you assume continuous change and build those feedback loops into your operating model, then even bad policy, even bad AI, even a bad service system can become good over time if you actually build feedback loops that feed into continuous improvement. So building those more adaptive, iterative, and continuously changing systems that reflect public values is a critical part.
Fantastic. Thanks, Pia, for those insights. And so I'll dive right into some of what we are hearing in terms of questions from our audience. There are lots of questions, so we'll try and throw them out and see between Sariu and Pia who would take some of these. But perhaps this particular one, I'd put it to you, Sariu. There's a question saying, would you say that the proper application of machine learning would be to assess and evaluate present human-based outcomes rather than make any effort to automate decisions? So that's for you, Sariu. And then for you, Pia, there's a question here that says, how does the involvement of algorithms affect people's sense of procedural justice? Can decisions be appealed or challenged if they could not have been otherwise? I'll pause there and then maybe come in for the last round of questions that we're hearing from the audience.
Right. The first question around limiting the role of machine learning to evaluate outcomes, there definitely is a case, but I'd like to take us back to the broader discussion around the social political context in which technology operates, and letting that determine the role of technology than being constrained by a view around what role it can play in areas or in contexts where automated decisions, should they affect or sort of contradict established principles of law, not be in accordance with the rule of law more broadly speaking? Um, if it's operating in a context where there is not necessarily institutional resilience, there's not necessarily capacity on the ground, then perhaps there's a case to say use it as a supportive mechanism, if I've understood the correct question correctly. But in other contexts where there is a functioning legal system, perhaps there's a case for broader use for technology. Now, what I recognize this does is that it can enhance the inequality between countries or sort of contexts quite significantly if we are sort of calibrating only against context. But nonetheless, I think there's a case to link it back to where is the technology operating, what are the capacities that are existing, is there an ability to naturally bring in stakeholders into the governance process? So all of those should drive this decision, and it's not a principle that should be imagined in abstraction. Back to you, Rachel.
Thanks, Saryu. Pia, your thoughts on whether the involvement of algorithms can affect people's sense of procedural justice, and can decisions be appealed or challenged?
Thank you. May I first confirm, is my sound okay? Okay. So I want to firstly say that this is not a set position. This, in fact, one of the problems that I see is that whenever people talk about AI in government, it seems to be an all or nothing. Do you AI or do you not AI? And let's find the middle ground. Even some of the framing of this conversation has almost assumed that there's a dichotomy and that there's a middle ground to be found. So the first thing to acknowledge is that even the notion of differentiating decision-making systems from all the other use cases of AI is a huge step forward, and you can embrace that as a useful way to differentiate, right? So from a procedural justice perspective, I agree entirely with how the question is framed, which is if a machine is making a decision, then it's not that the machine or the judge are inherently going to get a better outcome. We know that humans make flawed judgments and have all throughout our collective histories. But the difference is that the judge is accountable, the judge is appealable. The problem with machines making a decision without accountability, without explainability, and a rules-based approach is explainable. Machine learning-based approach is not explainable. This is the key difference between these two types of AI. But if you take a machine learning-based approach, which is not explainable, of course, people are not only going to feel, but the reality is you lack access to justice, you lack procedural fairness, and you lack the ability to comply to administrative law and rule of law, as I've said. So the key thing here is, I remember having a big conversation with a machine learning specialist friend of mine, and his point was, but if over time, as data accumulates, that the AI can actually come out with a more fair judgment, because you can use AI to identify patterns of inequity and then to correct for those patterns of inequity, which is quite interesting. And I said, well, that's a possibly good outcome. But of course, it shouldn't be a machine making that choice. If you're going to change precedent, it needs to be a person, a member of the judiciary, who has that delegated authority and is expected to have that authority. Trust is not just a matter of doing the right thing. Trust is actually three things. Trust is in good faith, in a legitimate way, and working as expected. And when you start working outside of those three, particularly in the third one, when you start operating in government in a way that is completely not expected, we lose legitimacy. And then the legitimacy of everything the government administers, from decisions to services right through to democratic norms like elections, start to lose trust and credibility with the population that it's supposed to serve. So going back to the liberal democracy's point, it is so critical that we make key decisions about how to make sure that we don't just get efficient government, but that we get good and responsible government in the adoption of these technologies, not just now, but forever. Otherwise, the very basis of our democracy becomes undermined.
Great. Thanks, Pia and Saryu. I just wanted to get to a place where we can now wrap up by reflecting on where we started from. So we started from asking the question whether the use of artificial intelligence, machine learning, algorithms in government can create a more inclusive, equitable, trusted, or digital future for people. And I really appreciate your perspectives that you've shared here. And in summary, what I've been hearing is, yes, we do acknowledge that there's a dark side and there's a good side. And some of what I've heard is that we do acknowledge that, yes, artificial intelligence, machine learning can introduce determinism. It does break us down into islands, breaks down communities. It brings in perspectives of bias in some cases. There's a potential to exacerbate inequalities, surveillance, or these being used as a weapon of the state. We also heard of other dimensions of where machine learning or artificial intelligence could be used to advance misogamy, racism, aspects of data marginalization, where other demographic segments of the population would be left behind. Now, that's like the dark side, but it's not completely dark. There is hope. And we've heard some of the recommendations, and we do know that artificial intelligence and machine learning has great potential to be used to enhance public good use cases in health, in agriculture, in education, we name it. We've also heard that perhaps we should focus on transitioning artificial intelligence into augmented intelligence, and we should focus on rules-based artificial intelligence rather than machine-based artificial intelligence, and that as we measure the impact, we'd rather focus on human impact measurement systems and enhance the right to know and the right to explainability. I really want to thank my two panelists today for the great insights that you have shared and for giving us a good picture of what the utopian would look like and what the dystopian would look like. It does look like there are both opportunities and risks. Ultimately, we hopefully can land somewhere in the middle in a beautiful world where artificial intelligence transitions into augmented intelligence and can enhance the well-being of people and not otherwise. On that note, I would like to close and thank you all for making time to join us. My colleague, Victoria, is going to be putting some resources in the chat for our use and for those that might want to reference some material to help in breaking down this conversation or this topic further. But thank you so much to Saryu for joining us so late. You've managed to keep up. We really appreciate you. And for Pia, for your time and your contributions to you both. Thank you.